Here I have the shutter in front of me. The retaining ring can come off the back. I've just parked that there while I was looking at this, and I see that the rear group is coming loose. It's okay, saves me having to fight with that. Now the front group. Normally you can get that off with your fingers. Sometimes a friction tool's handy. Let's try a friction tool. Yep, that got it loose. There are more drastic measures, but they're reserved for times when you need more drastic measures. Just remove one of these screws and swing that nameplate out of the way. Let's find a container to put these little bits in. And a pair of tweezers would be handy. That'll do for the moment. I need to expose this lock here. That's a rivet, not a screw, but got two holes in it to engage a suitable tool. You can get away with a pair of stiff tweezers frequently. I've got a screwdriver with the tip suitably modified. But I just need to rotate that so it's not locking in against the centre. Then turn this anti-clockwise to line up the protrusions with the little cutouts, and that should lift off. I mean, in an ideal world it would lift off by itself, but often you need to lift the shutter speed settings cam plate in order to encourage that to come up. And with that we're pretty much into the shutter. We'll lift the shutter speed settings cam plate on the off here. Nothing exciting to see there, that's all pretty straightforward. We're into the shutter itself. Now this one has 3 blades. This is a Compur shutter. Its supposed top speed is 300th of a second. I'll just unhook this spring here for the main lever from its post and wriggle the main lever out. I want all this control stuff off here. So I'll start by holding down the shutter release, which swings this arm down and gives me access through this hole to that screw. That screw holds the cable release socket, and that cable release socket would normally have a little plunger release plugged into it. So I want this piece out. This is the return spring for the shutter release. And that lever also operates the shutter release through the cable release. And here's the high speed spring, which presumably in this case provides the 300th of a second speed. There's a single screw here, holds this little plate in place, and that holds this lever. And this lever latches the shutter in the cocked position until you release it. The shutter release lever now should lift off its post, working that up off the pin. Now this has a very fine spring on it. Be aware of that spring and take great care not to make a mess of it. This is the B and T lever. It's got a fine spring as well on that acts against this lever. Now the screw passes through a little brass bush So be aware of that, don't lose it. That's the screw. There's our brass bush. It's got a shoulder on that bush that the lever runs around. Lift out our lever. As I say, be very cautious of that very fine spring on there. That's all I need to remove from the top of the shutter. At the base of the shutter we have 3 screws which hold the mechanism plate and the shutter case together. I'm keeping a lot of downward pressure on the screwdriver. Those screws are very tight and it's imperative that you do not slip and let the screwdriver cam out, otherwise you'll just make a mess of the screw and that will make it very hard to get the screw out. Okay, we can split the case and the mechanism plate. As you can see, we have 3 blades. They are all retained on the plate with screws, and we'll have to get those off in due course and clean them. You can also probably see that they're a bit grimy looking, particularly around the edges. Probably prone to sticking in cold weather, I would think. And here's the diaphragm. There's certainly oil on those diaphragm blades. That makes them stiff. Again, most prone in cold weather. On this one, this diaphragm's a bit awkward to put together, and it's because this is our moving plate here. There's no retainer plate, there's just the moving plate. And the moving plate is screwed through to our settings lever at the back. So it's a bit of a wiggle getting this all together. But it's got to come apart. So I'll remove those 2 screws. And the settings lever comes loose from the back. Tip this up, the entire diaphragm is out. Here's our case, and you can see the holes in the case. That's where these pins on the diaphragm blades will eventually have to seat. The case is quite dirty and will certainly need to be cleaned. I'll separate these pieces, get my 2 shoulder screws, and here's the blades, and you can see some of them are stuck together. Now they're stuck together with oil, so definitely that needed to be cleaned. So all these components need to be cleaned to get rid of all that oil, and typically I start here and I start doing the shutter case and the diaphragm, get that working clean and working to my satisfaction, and then move on to doing the mechanism plate. Get all of this clean, stripped down, cleaned and working, and then assemble the mechanism plate and the diaphragm, the shutter case together, and then put the other shutter components back in. Easy. Start cleaning these diaphragm blades. The diaphragm blades, you have to be cautious cleaning these because the little rivets that form the pivots for the blades are easy to catch on your cleaning cotton bud or Q-tip, and you don't want to damage the blades at all. If they get bent, and it's easy to bend them by catching something on them, they are very difficult to reassemble. Now the light here today is very poor. I'm working beside the window. I've got every room light on and it is difficult seeing these blades. But I've got to work through to all 10 of these diaphragm blades. And here I'm just using the back of my tweezers to hold this on the paper while I work, but I am using very, very little pressure on those tweezers. I just want to stop the blades running away, not applying enough force to damage the blades in any way. The blades are not symmetrical. The pins at one end of the blade will be closer to the centre line than the other. Though having said that, I'm not seeing it today, so perhaps these ones are symmetrical. Oh, they look like they are. They're making a liar of me. Generally speaking, the blades are not symmetrical. Let's leave it at that. Normally the rivets are closer to the edge of the blade at one end and closer to the centre line of the blade at the other. In this case, that's not what I'm seeing. These blades do appear to be symmetrical. So all I can say to that is take great note of the blades you have in front of you. There may be another difference here. It's quite possible that the pivots are taller on one end than they are on the other. And I'm just going to inspect these blades closely and have a look. They are. Okay. Now the taller of the two rivets, they go into the case. The indentations in the case. The shorter rivets, they go into the moving plate. If you mix those up, you'll have trouble. So I'll put these all the same way up, so that as I pick them up, I'm picking them all up in the same direction. And in theory at least, I'm less likely to make a mistake. I'll just work through and clean these 10 blades and then start cleaning the other components here. I have the blades all clean now and I can clean up these other components. I'll start here with the settings lever from the back of the shutter. And the state of this doesn't have much bearing on how the diaphragm actually works. That's all nice and clean. The moving plate from inside the case. This is only a little bit oily. There's not an awful lot coming off here, which is all to the good. Now one side of this plate faces the shutter blades, the other side faces the diaphragm blades. One side has the holes are countersunk there for the screws, so you can tell that's the side that faces the shutter blades, not the diaphragm blades. Now this is unusual. See if I can get that to catch the light. Yeah, there you go. There's a series of scratches across here. I've got no idea what they're doing there. And there's another screw here, a scratch here. I don't know how they've got there. It wouldn't even be easy to access that unless the shutter was apart. I can only assume that that damage was done while the shutter was apart. And why someone felt the need to do that, I'm blowed if I know. It's not something you could achieve by accident. And the case, I need to do the case. The case is probably the dirtiest of them all. I'll start with the inside. I can see yellow staining here of oil. I want to get all of this very clean. The diaphragm blades obviously pivot in these holes, and so the blades are in contact with these surfaces. So all of these surfaces need to be clean. And you can see the state of the cotton bud there. There's a lot of dirt. I'll clean inside the rear tube. That's where the rear lens group screws in, and the outside of course is where the retaining ring sits. Diaphragm blades aren't just stacked in on top of each other like shutter blades. They're interleaved, which means they're over the next blade at one end and under the next blade at the other. That makes them entertaining to install. There's two ways you can go about installing these diaphragm blades. You could start by stacking them in the case like this. And it's just jammed up in there. I've lifted it into a pocket. And into the case the longer of the two pins is going in. Like that, and you'd go around and stack them all in sequence until you got to the end, and then you'd have to lift these ones up slightly to allow you to get the other blades tucked in underneath them. That's actually very difficult to achieve. And the alternative method is to build them on the moving plate and then fit the case over the top and get those pins lined up with these holes. And that's the method I'm going to use because I know it works, it's just a bit tedious. Okay, let's see if I can achieve this. Now I know this has to be plain side up, the countersunk holes on the underside here when I put this on the jig. Now the blades have to go in here with the taller of the pins upwards, the shallower of the pins into the plate, and that's because the taller pins would stick through too far there and they would actually foul the shutter blades. And these have just got to be stacked in sequence until I get round to the beginning. I've got to be careful here not to pick the blades up from the wrong end and end up with a long pin sticking out through this plate. The diaphragm blades are slightly awkward for me to handle because the pins point up or down at the opposite end of the plate than they normally do for the other later shutters. So it means that I'm assembling this in the wrong orientation to what I'm used to. It shouldn't technically be any more difficult, it's just a different orientation. And I'm just keeping looking at this to make sure that I'm putting the blades the right way up, and that I haven't put a blade in upside down. Now, I'm at the stage now where I've got to pull back the earlier blades to get the more blades fitted. This is where it gets slightly messy. As you can see, I'm using a wooden toothpick to help me manoeuvre these blades around. They're very light, which means they're very easily displaced. And you don't want to displace them. Now get these blades pulled back. I've got 2 more blades to fit. I think one of my blades has become displaced, so I'm going to have fun getting this together. This is the last blade. Now I've got to lift these blades back over the top without disturbing anything. Like that. And move these blades, swing these blades back in. This plate's not sitting flat on my jig either. It means that the hole in the centre, it must be slightly smaller than I'm normally dealing with, and so it's sitting up on the cone of this piece here. Well, that looks quite good. Now I've got to get the case over the top, but of course I've got to get it in the correct position so that it's in the position where the aperture is fully open. Ah! Well, that was a bit of a disaster. I don't know if I'll be able to get those pushed back into place. No, I'm going to have to start again there. Dropping that thing on there has just caused me a lot of grief. That plate doesn't sit quite down flush there. I just about need I might put a little touch, a bit of tape or something under the edges so that this sits level and it's not rocking on me while I'm assembling it. And once I've got those blades ready to put the case on again, I'll bring you back.